Welcome back, listeners, to a special episode of Radio 13, a chilling detective horror series. Tonight, we continue with The Seven Curses, Episode 3. Sit back, relax, and enjoy a fantastic weekend evening with us. Chapter 1. The Green-Eyed Monster. The air inside Shadow Ridge Hospital felt thicker than usual as Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter made their way deeper into the old structure. Dust particles swirled in the dim light of their flashlights, casting eerie shadows along the crumbling walls. They had barely survived the last curse, and the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on each of their minds. Jason couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was watching him. The hospital had that effect. It was like it breathed, constantly shifting just out of sight. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his nerves on edge. But it wasn't just the dark, decaying building that unsettled him. It was something else, something deeper. The trio had come to a halt in what used to be the hospital's patient lounge, now a hollow shell of its former self. The peeling wallpaper barely clung to the walls, and old furniture sat like abandoned ghosts in the gloom. Jason felt a chill crawl down his spine, but it wasn't the cold that bothered him. It was the way he felt when he looked at Dr. Carter. She stood a few feet away, rifling through a stack of old records they had found. Her composure and intellect always amazed him, but tonight there was something else, something darker lurking behind his admiration. It twisted in his chest like a knot, leaving him uneasy. Jealousy. The realization hit him hard, and he shook his head, trying to shake off the emotion. What did he have to be jealous of? Dr. Carter was a brilliant physician, yes, but Jason had his own strengths. He had been the one to uncover vital clues about the curses, the one who had found the dagger that could sever their deadly hold. But still, the feeling gnawed at him. "I think I found something," Dr. Carter said, breaking the silence. Jason snapped out of his thoughts and walked over to where she stood, Emily trailing behind him. Carter handed him a faded record, her brow furrowed with concern. "This is about a patient named Rachel. She was here decades ago, and it looks like she was consumed by envy. It destroyed her, and I think it might be the origin of this curse." Jason took the file, skimming over the details. Rachel had been institutionalized for severe paranoia and delusions, but the underlying cause was more than just mental illness. She had fixated on other patients, those who had recovered, those who had families who visited regularly, even the doctors who seemed to have everything she never could. The jealousy had festered in her mind until it completely overtook her. Emily leaned in, her face pale as she read over Jason's shoulder. "It says here she believed the hospital owed her something, that everyone around her was stealing the life she deserved." Dr. Carter nodded grimly. "And it didn't stop there. According to the records, she became violent. She attacked other patients, accusing them of taking things that were never theirs to begin with. Things like their health, their families, their futures." Jason's throat tightened. The more they learned about Rachel, the more he could feel the curse creeping into his own thoughts. It was subtle at first, but now it was like a low hum at the back of his mind, constantly reminding him of what he didn't have, what he wasn't. Emily stepped away, her gaze distant. "I think it's already started." "What do you mean?" Jason asked, though deep down he knew exactly what she was talking about. Emily turned to face him, her eyes clouded with worry. "I can feel it, this envy. It's like a shadow in my head, whispering to me. I keep thinking about what you have, about the fact that you're always the one who finds the answers, the one who has the courage to take the risks." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to be so open about it. He had always admired Emily's determination, but now, as she stood there admitting her own envy, he realized he wasn't the only one struggling. Dr. Carter's voice was calm, but there was a tightness to it now. "That's how the curse works. It feeds on jealousy, amplifies it. The more we give in to those feelings, the stronger it gets." Jason gritted his teeth. He could feel it growing, pushing at the edges of his mind, whispering to him. Why wasn't he the one leading? Why was Dr. Carter always the one in charge? He had been the one to find the dagger, the one to face the last curse head-on. Yet here he was, still standing in her shadow. He glanced at Emily, wondering if she was thinking the same thing about him. Could he trust her? Could he trust either of them? The curse was twisting everything, making him question even the closest bonds. "Let's keep moving," Dr. Carter said, breaking the tension. "We need to find more about Rachel, about how the curse took hold of her. There has to be something in this hospital that can help us break it." Jason nodded, but as they made their way down the darkened hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The hospital wasn't just haunted by spirits or cursed objects, it was haunted by emotions. And envy was the most dangerous of all. As they descended deeper into the bowels of Shadow Ridge, the air grew heavier, thick with the weight of jealousy and resentment. The whispers grew louder, echoing in Jason's mind, feeding off his insecurities. "You're not good enough. They don't need you. You're just a burden." Each step felt harder than the last, each glance between them more charged with suspicion. The hospital's power was growing, and soon it would tear them apart from the inside. Jason's breath quickened as they approached the West Wing, where Rachel had spent her final days. The green-eyed monster of envy had already taken root in all of them, and if they couldn't find a way to stop it soon, there would be no escape. He could feel the curse tightening its grip, but there was no turning back now. They were too deep into the heart of the darkness, and the only way out was to face the curse head-on, if they could survive each other. Chapter 2. The hospital's most desperate patient. The corridors of Shadow Ridge Hospital seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, their decay more apparent the deeper Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter ventured into the forgotten halls. The smell of mold and old, stale air clung to everything. Their footsteps echoed ominously, bouncing off the cracked tiles and stained walls, but the three of them stayed silent, lost in their own thoughts, each battling the whispers of envy that now haunted their minds. Jason glanced at the others, wondering if they were feeling it as strongly as he was. The curse's grip had tightened since they learned about Rachel, the patient whose jealousy had consumed her. There was something about her story that Jason couldn't let go of. It was more than just the tragedy of a woman whose mind was undone by envy. It was the unsettling realization that they were all teetering on the same edge. "We're almost there," Dr. Carter said quietly, breaking the silence. They were approaching the West Wing, the abandoned part of the hospital where Rachel had lived out her final days. Jason could feel the atmosphere change as they crossed the threshold into this part of the building. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of Rachel's madness. "Why was she so desperate?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did envy take over her like that?" Dr. Carter pulled out the file they'd found earlier, flipping through the yellowed pages as they walked. According to her records, Rachel was admitted to Shadow Ridge after suffering from severe delusions. She believed everyone around her had something she deserved: health, wealth, family, happiness, and she became obsessed with it. She thought the hospital could cure her, that it could give her the life she thought she was owed. Jason shook his head. But the hospital couldn't help her, could it? Dr. Carter looked up from the file, her expression grim. No. In fact, the more time she spent here, the worse she became. She started to believe that the hospital wasn't just a place of healing, but a place that owed her something, like it had stolen her life away. The jealousy consumed her to the point where she attacked other patients. She thought they were taking her share of happiness. Emily swallowed hard, clearly disturbed by the story. And now we're dealing with the same thing. Jason didn't respond, but he knew Emily was right. The curse of envy was already working its way into their minds. He could feel it gnawing at the back of his thoughts, whispering to him that Dr. Carter's leadership was overshadowing his contributions, that Emily's admiration for Carter left little room for her to value him. The further they walked, the more Jason felt Rachel's presence lingering in the air around them, like a specter watching from just out of sight. "Here," Dr. Carter said, stopping in front of a heavy, rusted door. This was Rachel's room. Jason stared at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The paint was peeling, and the metal had long since rusted, but there was something unmistakably ominous about it. He could almost hear Rachel's voice calling to them from inside, her jealousy still seething even in death. Emily hesitated. "Are we sure we want to go in there?" "We don't have a choice," Dr. Carter replied. "If we want to break this curse, we need to understand what happened to her. We need to understand how she became the hospital's most desperate patient." Jason nodded, though a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the cold, corroded handle. With a groan of metal on metal, the door creaked open. The room inside was small, almost claustrophobic. The bed, still bolted to the floor, was rusted and covered in rotting sheets. A single window, long boarded up, let in a thin sliver of dying daylight. The walls were covered in scratches, hundreds of them, as if Rachel had spent her final days clawing at the walls in a desperate attempt to escape. "What the hell happened here?" Jason whispered, stepping inside. Dr. Carter was already scanning the room, her eyes sharp. Rachel's mind deteriorated in here. She believed everyone had something she didn't, and the jealousy drove her mad. It said she died here, consumed by the very envy that cursed her. Emily moved cautiously around the room, her gaze shifting from the scratches on the wall to the shattered mirror near the bed. "I can't imagine what it must have been like to live with that kind of obsession, that level of desperation." Jason knelt near the bed, running his fingers over the floor where the scratches had dug deep into the wood. His breath caught in his throat as he realized they weren't random marks, they were words. They took it, all of it. Jason looked up at the others, his voice low. "She wrote something." Dr. Carter moved closer, peering at the scratches. "What does it say?" "She believed someone had taken everything from her," Jason said, tracing the words with his finger. "It's like she thought the world owed her something, and when it didn't deliver, she went mad." Emily looked horrified. "And now her jealousy is infecting this place. That's why the curse is so powerful here." Jason stood up, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on him. "We need to find a way to sever the curse, before it turns us against each other." As if on cue, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the room. The three of them froze, their eyes snapping to the far corner. The darkness seemed to shift, and for a moment, Jason swore he saw a figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with long, tangled hair. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "Rachel?" Her voice, barely more than a whisper, seemed to drift through the air. "You'll never have enough. None of you will. They took it all from me, and now I'll take it from you." The room plunged into a deep chill as the temperature dropped suddenly. Jason's breath came out in visible puffs, and his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the jealousy clawing at his thoughts, urging him to turn on the others, to blame them for everything he didn't have. "Stay calm," Dr. Carter said, though her voice wavered. "It's just the curse. We have to stay focused." But it was hard to focus with Rachel's voice growing louder, more insistent. "You'll never be good enough, Jason. Dr. Carter will always be better than you. She'll always have what you want." Jason clenched his fists, fighting the urge to scream at the voice in his head. He could see Emily and Dr. Carter struggling too, their faces tense with concentration. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaking, "before it gets worse." But Jason wasn't sure if they could escape the curse that easily. The envy was already inside them, whispering, gnawing, festering. And Rachel's voice wasn't going to stop until it had consumed them all. As they left Rachel's room, Jason cast one last look back at the empty bed, the scratches on the walls, and the shadow that still seemed to lurk in the corner. The hospital's most desperate patient wasn't finished with them yet. Chapter 3. The Voices. The hallways of Ridge Hospital twisted and turned like a labyrinth, each corridor leading deeper into the heart of the curse. Jason's footsteps felt heavier with every step, as if the weight of the hospital's dark history was slowly dragging him down. The silence was unnerving, only occasionally broken by the soft creaks and groans of the old building settling into itself. But the silence wasn't the worst part. It was the voices. At first, they had been little more than whispers, faint and barely audible, like the murmur of a distant conversation. But now, as they pressed further into the hospital's west wing, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just echoes of the past. They were inside Jason's head, tugging at the fragile threads of his sanity. "They think you're weak." Jason winced, trying to block it out. He wasn't weak. He had proven himself time and again. He had faced the first curse head-on, found the clues that had saved them all, but the voices wouldn't stop. "They don't trust you. They never did." He glanced at Emily and Dr. Carter walking just ahead of him. Were they hearing it too? They didn't seem affected. But how could they not be? The voices were loud enough to drown out his own thoughts. His heartbeat quickened, thudding painfully in his chest. "Jason, are you okay?" Emily asked, turning to look at him with concern in her eyes. He forced a smile, nodding, though the truth was he felt like he was on the edge of losing control. The whispers seemed to crawl under his skin, making him question everything: his worth, his decisions, even his place in the group. Dr. Carter slowed down, glancing at him as well. "The curse is getting stronger. The voices are part of it. We have to stay focused." Jason nodded again, but the unease remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that the voices weren't just manifestations of his own insecurities. It was as if they were coming from the hospital itself, as though the walls were alive with the remnants of those who had suffered here, their jealous spirits lingering long after death. "She's smarter than you. She'll figure it out first." The voice was sharper now, digging into Jason's mind like a knife. He clenched his fists, willing the thoughts away. He knew what the curse was doing. It was trying to turn them against each other, to amplify the envy that already lingered in their hearts. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to resist. They turned a corner, and suddenly, the whispers seemed to shift, growing more distinct. Jason froze, listening intently. This time, the voices weren't coming from his mind. They were coming from further down the hall. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, her face pale. "I do." Dr. Carter was already moving ahead, her flashlight scanning the walls as they reached a set of double doors. They were rusted and warped, but the faint sound of voices was unmistakable, seeping through the cracks like a low, desperate hum. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jason swallowed hard. "It sounds like people talking. Or arguing," Dr. Carter added, her eyes narrowing. She reached for the door handle and hesitated. "We need to see what's behind this." With a nod from Jason, Dr. Carter yanked the doors open, and a rush of cold air hit them like a slap. Beyond the doors lay a large, shadowy room, what looked like an old communal ward, filled with rows of rusted, empty hospital beds. And in the center of the room stood a group of figures, their bodies flickering in and out of focus, like old film projections. The voices were coming from them. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized what they were seeing. The figures were patients, but they weren't alive. Their forms were translucent, their faces contorted with anger and frustration. They stood facing one another, shouting, though their words were muffled, distorted. It was a scene of pure chaos, and yet none of the figures seemed to notice the group watching them. "This must be some sort of memory," Dr. Carter said quietly, stepping forward. Jason hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay back. There was something deeply unsettling about these figures, something more than just their ghostly appearances. The room crackled with energy, the kind that made his skin crawl. "They're arguing," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "It's the envy. They're consumed by it." Jason's eyes darted from one figure to the next. He could see it in their faces, the way their features twisted with jealousy and hatred. They were yelling at each other, accusing, blaming, fighting over things that probably didn't matter, not in the grand scheme of things. But to them, in their twisted minds, it was everything. "This must have been what happened to Rachel," Dr. Carter said, her voice tense. "She wasn't the only one affected by the curse. It spread through the hospital, infecting everyone." Jason stepped closer to one of the figures, a tall man whose face was contorted in rage as he shouted at a woman across from him. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with fury. The woman yelled back, her voice shrill and desperate. "They're trapped here," Jason murmured. "Trapped in their own jealousy, forever reliving the moment they lost control." Dr. Carter nodded grimly. "The curse didn't just destroy Rachel. It destroyed everyone it touched. These people were once patients here, but now they're nothing more than echoes, consumed by their envy." The figures continued to argue, their voices rising in intensity. Jason could feel the energy in the room building, like a storm about to break. The air grew colder, and the whispers in his own mind grew louder, feeding off the emotions swirling around him. You'll never be good enough. You'll always be in her shadow. Jason clenched his jaw, trying to push the thoughts away, but they were relentless. He could feel the jealousy creeping into his mind, making him doubt everything, his worth, his place in the group, his very existence. "I can't take this," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "The voices, they're in my head. I can't stop them." Jason looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. She was fighting the same battle he was, struggling to keep the envy at bay. But it was getting harder with every passing second. The curse was too strong. "We need to leave," Dr. Carter said urgently. "Now." Jason didn't argue. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. They turned to leave, but as they reached the door, the voices in the room surged, rising to a deafening crescendo. "You'll never be enough." The words hit Jason like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled, his head spinning as the jealousy flooded his mind, overwhelming him. "You're nothing compared to them." He gasped for breath, his vision blurring as the voices in his head grew louder, more vicious. His thoughts spiraled out of control, drowning in a sea of envy and self-doubt. But then, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the edge. Jason blinked, his vision clearing enough to see Dr. Carter standing beside him, her grip firm on his arm. "Stay with me," she said, her voice steady. "Don't let it take over." Jason nodded, though the voices still whispered in the back of his mind. Together, they stumbled out of the room, slamming the doors shut behind them. The voices dimmed slightly, but they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. As they stood in the dim hallway, catching their breath, Jason realized something chilling. The voices weren't going to stop. Not until they had claimed them all. Chapter 4. The Temptation. Jason hadn't slept. The voices were quieter now, but they lingered in the back of his mind like a bad memory. He lay awake in the small, cramped room they had been assigned in the hospital's makeshift living quarters. Emily was asleep in the next bed, though her face was far from peaceful. She twitched occasionally, her brow furrowed in her sleep, no doubt still haunted by the same whispers that plagued him. The hospital felt even colder at night, the shadows longer and more oppressive. Jason could feel it pressing in on him, the curse, the weight of envy that seemed to have taken root in his very soul. He sat up slowly, rubbing his hands over his face in an attempt to shake the fog of exhaustion from his mind. Dr. Carter had left the room hours earlier, saying she needed time to analyze the situation. Jason had wanted to help, but he could tell from her tone that she needed space. He had no choice but to leave her to her work. Now, in the dark silence, Jason found himself lost in thought, the events of the day swirling in his mind. The figures in the old ward, the jealousy that had consumed them, it was all connected to the curse. But there was something deeper at play, something that seemed to be targeting him specifically. "You want what they have, don't you?" The voice slithered into his thoughts again, soft and insidious. Jason gritted his teeth. He knew it wasn't real, knew it was the curse trying to manipulate him, but didn't make it any easier to ignore. "You've always been second best, always living in someone else's shadow." Jason stood abruptly, unable to stand the voice any longer. He grabbed his jacket and quietly slipped out of the room, careful not to wake Emily. He needed to clear his head, needed to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of the room. The hospital was eerily quiet at this hour, the only sound his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows on the cracked tile floors. Jason walked aimlessly, trying to push the thoughts out of his head, but as he turned down yet another corridor, he heard something different from the usual creaks and groans of the hospital. It was a voice, but not the kind he had been hearing in his head. This one was real, soft and melodic, drifting through the air like a distant song. Jason froze, straining to listen. The voice seemed to be coming from down the hall, around the corner. Against his better judgment, he followed it, his footsteps quickening as the sound grew louder. He rounded the corner and stopped dead in his tracks. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure, She was beautiful, her long dark hair cascading down her shoulders in soft waves. She wore an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her pale face glowing in the dim light. Her eyes, large and captivating, locked onto Jason the moment he stepped into view. "Jason," she whispered, her voice soft and inviting. "I've been waiting for you." Jason's heart raced, his mind whirling with confusion and fear. He knew he should turn and run, knew that this was part of the curse. But something about her was drawing him in, making it impossible to look away. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The woman smiled, a slow, almost seductive smile. "I'm here to help you, Jason. I know what you've been feeling, what you've been struggling with. The envy, it's eating you alive, isn't it?" Jason swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But he couldn't. The woman's words seemed to sink into his mind, pulling him closer. "I know what it's like," she continued, stepping toward him. "To always feel like you're not enough. To see others succeed while you're left behind. But you don't have to feel that way anymore." Jason shook his head, backing away from her slightly. I don't want that." The woman's smile widened. "But you do, Jason. I can see it in your eyes. The curse has already taken hold of you, hasn't it? You want what they have. You want to be the one in control." Jason felt a pang of fear deep in his chest. The words cut too close to the truth. He had been feeling it, the envy, the resentment. It had started as a whisper, but now it was a constant presence in his mind, gnawing at him from the inside. "You don't have to fight it," the woman whispered, her voice soothing. "Give in to it. Let it consume you. It's the only way to be free." Jason stared at her, torn between the desire to flee and the strange, almost hypnotic pull she had over him. Her eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, beckoning him to step closer, to give in to the temptation she offered. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted," she continued, her voice wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "Power, respect, control. You'll never have to feel second best again." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The words were so tempting, so easy to believe. For a moment he imagined it, what it would be like to have everything he'd ever wanted, to be free of the jealousy that plagued him. He could see himself standing tall, no longer in the shadow of others. The feeling of power surged through him, intoxicating and dangerous. But then, a memory flashed in his mind. Rachel, the first victim of the curse. The way envy had consumed her, twisted her into something unrecognizable. He had seen what the curse did to people, how it destroyed them from the inside out. "No," Jason whispered, shaking his head. I won't let it take me." The woman's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're stronger than I thought," she said, her voice no longer soft and inviting. It had taken on an edge, cold and dangerous. "But the curse isn't something you can just walk away from." Jason stepped back, his resolve hardening. "I don't want what you're offering." The woman's smile disappeared entirely, her face contorting into something darker, more sinister. "You'll regret that decision," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "The curse won't stop. It will eat away at you until there's nothing left." Jason turned and ran, his heart racing as the woman's voice echoed behind him, growing fainter with every step. "You can't escape it, Jason. It's already inside you." He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the living quarters. Slamming the door behind him, his breath came in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from the encounter. But as he leaned against the door, trying to calm his racing heart, the voices in his head whispered once more. "She's right, you know. You can't escape it." Jason clenched his fists, determination flooding through him. He would prove them wrong. But deep down, he knew the temptation would be harder to resist than he ever imagined. Chapter 5. Rachel's Return. The hospital was quieter than usual as Jason sat in the makeshift kitchen, sipping cold coffee from a cracked mug. His hands were still trembling from his encounter with the strange woman last night, and he could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. The voices were still there, though they had grown softer, almost as if they were watching, waiting for him to slip again. Emily sat across from him, poking at a stale piece of toast. Her eyes were red and puffy, the result of another sleepless night. Neither of them had spoken much since Jason had returned to the room hours earlier. There was too much to say, too many horrors they were both trying to process. But as they sat in silence, the door creaked open, and Dr. Carter stepped inside, her face tight with exhaustion. She dropped a stack of papers on the table and sat down with a heavy sigh. "I've been looking into Rachel's case," Dr. Carter said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I found something." Jason's stomach twisted at the mention of Rachel. The first victim of the hospital's curse, the woman who had been consumed by envy until it drove her mad. He hadn't been able to get her face out of his mind, the hollow look in her eyes, the way she had screamed before vanishing into the dark halls. "What did you find?" Emily asked, her voice hoarse. Dr. Carter hesitated, glancing at both of them before continuing. "Rachel wasn't just a patient here. She was involved with the hospital on a deeper level. From what I could gather, she was an administrator, one of the people responsible for funding the renovations." Jason furrowed his brow. "How does that connect to the curse?" Dr. Carter pulled out a faded photograph from the stack of papers and slid it across the table. Jason leaned forward to get a closer look. The image showed a group of people standing in front of the hospital, smiling for the camera. At the center of the group was Rachel, looking younger, happier, alive. "This was taken before the curse manifested," Dr. Carter said, "before things went wrong." Jason's eyes lingered on the photo. It was hard to reconcile the smiling woman in the picture with the tormented figure they had seen just days ago. "She was driven by envy," Dr. Carter continued, her voice growing more somber. "There were others in her circle, people with more power, more influence. Rachel wanted to be like them, wanted what they had. When the hospital fell into financial trouble, she made deals, dark deals, trying to secure its future." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen what envy could do, how it could twist and corrupt. It wasn't just the hospital that was cursed. It was the people who had laid the foundation of this place, their greed and ambition spreading like a disease. "What happened to her?" Jason asked. Dr. Carter hesitated, her eyes shifting to the window. "I'm not sure, but there are rumors that she's still here, wandering the halls." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the whispers about spirits trapped in the hospital, but this felt different. Rachel wasn't just any ghost. She was part of the curse itself. Emily leaned forward, her voice trembling. "You're saying she's still alive?" Dr. Carter shook her head. "Not alive, but not gone either. It's like she's caught between worlds, unable to rest because of the curse." Jason swallowed hard, the weight of Dr. Carter's words settling over him like a dark cloud. He had seen things in this hospital that defied explanation, but the thought of Rachel still being out there, still tied to the curse, made his skin crawl. As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Jason's pulse quickened. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice laced with fear. Jason's eyes darted toward the hallway. "Do you hear that?" The others fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the hospital's ancient heating system. But then, faint and distant, came a sound that made Jason's blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Jason's heart raced as he grabbed the flashlight from the table and motioned for the others to follow him. Emily hesitated, but Dr. Carter was already on her feet, her expression grim but determined. Together, they moved toward the door, the sound of the footsteps growing louder with every step they took. Jason led the way, his hand trembling as he gripped the flashlight tightly. The hallway stretched out before them, dimly lit by flickering lights overhead. There was no one in sight, but the footsteps continued, soft but unmistakable. "Where's it coming from?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason didn't answer. He already knew. He could feel it in his bones, the pull of the curse drawing them closer to its source. They turned the corner, and there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was a figure. Jason's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight beam landed on her face. Rachel. But it wasn't the Rachel from the photograph. This was something else, something twisted and broken. Her skin was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow as if the life had been drained from her. She wore the same hospital gown she had been in the last time they saw her, the fabric torn and stained with blood. She stood motionless, staring at them with empty eyes. "Rachel," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened to you?" For a long moment there was no response. Then slowly Rachel's lips began to move, her voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing unnaturally through the hallway. It was the envy. I couldn't stop it. It took everything. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The curse had consumed her, just as it was trying to consume him. "We can help you," Dr. Carter said, stepping forward. "We can break the curse." Rachel's eyes flicked to Dr. Carter, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she might respond, might acknowledge their presence. But then her face twisted into something dark, something full of rage and bitterness. "You can't stop it," she hissed. "It's too late for me. It's too late for all of you." Jason took a step back, his heart racing. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and he could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating. Rachel's eyes burned with fury as she took a step toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. "You'll never escape," she whispered, her voice echoing through the hall. "It's already inside you." Jason's breath caught in his throat as Rachel's form began to flicker, her body fading in and out like a bad signal. And then, in an instant, she was gone. The hallway was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Jason stood frozen, his mind racing. Rachel's words echoed in his head, the warning. The curse wasn't just something they could run from. It was inside them, too. Chapter 6. Turning against each other. The air in Shadow Ridge Hospital had grown thick with tension after the chilling encounter with Rachel. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter had returned to their room, but the weight of the curse lingered like a dark cloud hanging over them. Sleep had been impossible. Every creak, every distant whisper set their nerves on edge. Jason sat on the edge of his cot, staring blankly at the wall, replaying Rachel's haunting words in his head. "It's already inside you." He had tried to dismiss it as another trick of the curse, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was right. The curse had gotten to him. It had wormed its way into his mind, twisting his thoughts. He could feel it growing stronger, feeding off his fear and uncertainty. Across the room, Emily sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes wide and glassy as she stared into the corner. Dr. Carter was pacing back and forth, muttering to herself as she flipped through pages of her notes, but even her usually calm demeanor had started to crack. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally Dr. Carter broke it with a frustrated shout. "This doesn't make any sense," she snapped, slamming her notebook onto the table. "Everything I've found, all the research, it's not enough. There has to be something we're missing." Jason looked up at her, his jaw clenched. "Maybe because there's nothing we can do," he said, his voice cold. "Maybe Rachel was right. It's too late. We're already cursed." Dr. Carter whipped around to face him, her eyes blazing with anger. "Don't you dare give up on me now, Jason. We've come too far to start believing in the hopelessness of this curse." Jason shot to his feet, his hands trembling. "And what if it's true, huh? What if this is how it ends for us? You saw Rachel. She's beyond saving. We could be next." Emily flinched at Jason's words, her face pale. She hadn't spoken since they'd seen Rachel, her mind seemingly lost in a fog. Now she finally raised her head, her voice quiet but sharp. "Jason, stop," she whispered. "We're not giving up." But Jason couldn't stop. The anger boiling inside him was too much, too intense to control. The curse had latched onto his frustration, and he could feel it pushing him to lash out, to hurt the people around him. "Don't tell me to stop, Emily," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You've been sitting there in silence, acting like you know what to do, but none of us knows how to fix this. None of us can save each other." Emily recoiled as though he had struck her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say a word. She simply stared at him, the hurt etched on her face. Jason regretted his words the moment they left his mouth, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He wanted to apologize, to pull her into a hug and tell her everything would be okay, but the curse twisted his thoughts again, poisoning the air between them. Dr. Carter crossed her arms, stepping closer to Jason, her voice cold and commanding. "Get a hold of yourself, Jason. This is exactly what the curse wants. It's feeding on your emotions, turning us against each other." Jason sneered, feeling the bitterness rise in his throat. "Maybe it's just showing us the truth. Maybe we were never going to get out of this place." Emily stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Jason, stop it! This isn't you. The curse is making you say these things. You have to fight it. Jason's eyes flashed with anger as he turned on her. Fight it? How? You think I haven't been fighting it this whole time? His voice was rising, and he could feel the curse urging him to push harder, to hurt her more. You're just as scared as I am, Emily. Stop pretending like you're stronger than the rest of us. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks, but she held her ground, her voice trembling. I'm not pretending, Jason. I'm scared, but I'm not giving up. You can't give up either. Carter stepped between them, her voice firm. Enough, both of you. She looked directly at Jason, her eyes hard. You need to get a grip on yourself. If we start turning on each other, the curse wins. Do you want that? Jason's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The rage bubbling inside him was so strong, so overwhelming, but Dr. Carter's words cut through the fog, grounding him. He looked at Emily, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of Jason's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the anger began to drain from his body, leaving him feeling hollow and ashamed. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean it. I don't know what's happening to me. Emily wiped at her eyes, her voice soft but forgiving. It's okay, Jason. I know it's the curse. Dr. Carter placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, her grip firm. We're all under its influence, she said quietly. But we can't let it win. We have to stick together. Jason nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He had let the curse control him, had almost destroyed the only people he had left. The room was silent again, the tension lingering like a dark cloud overhead. But then, a sound broke the stillness. A soft metallic click echoed from somewhere down the hall. Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter all froze, their heads snapping toward the door. What was that? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Carter narrowed her eyes, her body tense. It came from the old wing, she said quietly. The same wing where we saw Rachel. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He had a terrible feeling in his gut, a sense that something was terribly wrong. But he couldn't deny the pull to investigate, to find out what was happening. We need to check it out, Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Emily looked at him with wide eyes. Are you sure? What if it's... I don't know, Jason interrupted, but we can't ignore it. Whatever's happening in this hospital, we're part of it now. We need to see this through. Dr. Carter nodded, her expression grim. Let's go. They moved cautiously down the hallway, the air growing colder with each step. The hospital was silent, save for the soft hum of the lights overhead, but the tension was thick, palpable. As they approached the old wing, the feeling of dread intensified. Jason's heart raced, his mind flashing back to Rachel's broken figure, her hollow eyes filled with rage. The door to the old wing stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. Dr. Carter stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he saw the room beyond. It was empty, completely empty, save for a single figure standing in the center of the room. Rachel. But she wasn't alone. Jason's blood ran cold as he realized there were others with her, figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted with envy, their hollow eyes locked on the three of them. And then, with a chilling smile, Rachel spoke. Welcome back. The curse had drawn them in once again. Chapter 7. Breaking the Illusion. The room was a vortex of shadows and tension, the air thick with an unseen presence that seemed to press against Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter like a physical weight. Rachel stood in the center of the darkened space, her face twisted into a cold smile. Around her, shadowy figures loomed, ghostly shapes of people whose faces were frozen in expressions of envy and rage, their eyes dull and hollow. Jason's pulse quickened as he locked eyes with Rachel. Her presence felt more oppressive, more dangerous than ever before. He could feel the curse pulsing in the air, twisting reality around them. The lines between what was real and what was illusion had blurred, and Jason wasn't sure where the truth ended and the nightmare began. You came back, Rachel said, her voice a slow, mocking drawl. I knew you would. Emily took a hesitant step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel, we're here to help you. Rachel's smile widened, her eyes narrowing. Help? You think you can help me now? You can't even help yourselves. Jason glanced at Dr. Carter, whose face was tense but determined. They had come this far, but now they were facing something far beyond their understanding. A darkness that had taken root in this hospital long ago, feeding on envy and twisting it into something malevolent. "We don't have time for this," Dr. Carter said firmly. "We need to end the curse. Rachel, whatever this is, it's not too late. You have to let go of this envy." Rachel laughed, a low and eerie sound that echoed around the room. "Let go? You think I can just let go? This curse has bound me here, made me one with it. You're as trapped as I am now." Jason felt the cold grip of fear tighten around him, but he couldn't give in to it. There had to be a way out, something they were missing. His eyes flickered to the shadowy figures surrounding Rachel. They were watching him, their faces twisted with jealousy and bitterness, but they didn't move. I think these people were like Rachel," Jason said slowly, trying to make sense of the scene. "They were consumed by envy, and the curse trapped them here." Dr. Carter nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "The curse feeds on negative emotions. It manipulates them, amplifies them. That's how it stays strong." Emily's voice wavered as she spoke, her eyes locked on Rachel. "But if that's true, then maybe there's still a way to break it. If we can stop feeding the curse, if we can reject the envy, maybe we can weaken it." Rachel's face twisted with anger at Emily's words. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice rising. "You can't break the curse. You're no different from me. You envy each other just like I did. It's already inside you." Jason's stomach churned at Rachel's words, but he pushed them aside. "We're not like you, Rachel," he said firmly. "We're not going to let this curse turn us against each other." For a moment, Rachel's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing her face, but it was quickly replaced by a sneer. "You're lying. You're just as weak as I am." Dr. Carter stepped forward, her eyes locked on Rachel. "Maybe we are weak," she said softly, "but we're not giving in. That's the difference, Rachel. You let the curse control you because you thought you had no choice. But we do." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the shadows around her began to stir, shifting and swirling like a black mist. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on Jason, Emily, and Dr. Carter. The air grew colder, and Jason could feel the weight of their envy pressing down on him, trying to pull him under. "This is an illusion," Dr. Carter whispered urgently, her voice cutting through the haze of fear. "It's all in our minds. The curse is trying to manipulate us." Jason clenched his fists, fighting the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that threatened to drown him. The curse was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. If this was all an illusion, then they could break it. "We have to reject it," Jason said, his voice shaking but resolute. "The envy, the fear, it's all a part of the curse. If we let it take over, we'll be trapped like Rachel. We have to resist." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. "We have to remember who we are. We have to hold on to that." Rachel's eyes blazed with fury as she watched them. "You think you can just walk away? You can't escape this. You'll never be free." But Jason didn't listen to her. He closed his eyes, focusing on the truth, on who he was before the curse had taken hold. He wasn't envious of anyone. He wasn't consumed by bitterness. He had friends, people who cared about him, and he wasn't going to let this place take that away from him. Slowly, the pressure in the room began to lift. The shadows surrounding them grew fainter, the figures retreating into the darkness. The air felt lighter, the weight of the curse easing as they resisted its grip. Jason opened his eyes, relief washing over him as he saw the room clearing. The shadowy figures had vanished, and Rachel stood alone in the center of the room, her face twisted with rage. "No," Rachel screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "You can't do this. You can't leave me here." Dr. Carter stepped forward, her expression somber. "Rachel, we're not leaving you, but you have to let go of the envy. It's the only way." Rachel's hands trembled, her face contorting with emotion. For a moment, it looked like she might reach out to them, might finally accept their help. But then, with a final agonized scream, she turned and fled into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting entirely. Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his heart still racing. "Is it over?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Dr. Carter shook her head. "No, not yet, But we've weakened the curse. We've taken the first step. Jason glanced at the spot where Rachel had stood, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. What about Rachel? He asked quietly. Will she ever be free? Dr. Carter's expression was grim. I don't know, she admitted. But as long as the curse still has a hold on this place, none of us are truly free. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just experienced hanging over them. The curse was still there, lurking in the shadows, but they had managed to break its illusion, at least for now. Jason knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time since entering Shadow Ridge Hospital, he felt a glimmer of hope. And in a place as dark as this, hope was the most powerful weapon they had. Chapter 8: A Shattered Bond. Jason couldn't shake the unsettling weight in his chest as they left the darkened room. The flickering lights overhead cast long, eerie shadows down the hospital's empty corridors. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something unseen was pulling at him, trying to drag him back into the depths of Shadow Ridge Hospital. Emily walked beside him, her face pale and her eyes wide, but there was a newfound strength in her steps. Dr. Carter led the way, her face grim, but her posture firm. They had resisted the curse's grasp for now, but the toll it had taken on them was clear. Do you think Rachel will ever come back? Emily's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would awaken the dark forces that still lingered in the walls. Jason glanced at Dr. Carter, hoping she had an answer, but the doctor didn't turn around. She just kept walking, her silence a loud testament to the uncertainty they all felt. I don't know, Jason finally answered, his voice low. But I think we have to keep moving forward. The curse isn't done with us. Emily nodded, her brow furrowed in worry. But what if it happens to us next? What if we're the ones who... She trailed off, but Jason knew what she meant. Rachel's downfall hadn't just been about envy, it was about isolation. She had been left alone with her twisted emotions, and in that solitude, the curse had latched onto her like a parasite, feeding on her weaknesses. And now, with each step, Jason felt the looming fear that one of them could be next. They approached a set of doors, the old wooden ones that led into what used to be the psychiatric ward. The hinges creaked as Dr. Carter pushed them open, the sound echoing in the desolate halls. I don't like this, Emily murmured. This place, it feels worse. Jason couldn't disagree. The air here was colder, sharper, and the shadows seemed darker, more malicious. But it wasn't just the hospital that made his skin crawl. It was the growing tension between them, the feeling that something was coming, something that could tear them apart. The bond they had formed over the last few days was fragile at best, held together by necessity and mutual fear. But now, after everything with Rachel, it felt like the cracks were beginning to show. They moved through the ward in silence, the eerie quiet only broken by the occasional dripping of water from the ceiling. Jason kept close to Emily, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. But it wasn't the physical threat that worried him. It was the emotional unraveling he could feel creeping up on them. As they reached an intersection of corridors, Dr. Carter stopped, her eyes narrowing as she looked down the two paths before them. This way, she said, pointing to the right, but her voice lacked the confidence it usually had. Jason could feel it now, the doubt. Dr. Carter wasn't as certain as she wanted them to believe. She was trying to hold it together for their sake, but the curse had already begun to work on her, and Jason knew that the fragile trust they had was starting to splinter. They continued down the right corridor, the cold seeping deeper into their bones. Jason's mind raced with thoughts of Rachel, of the shadowy figures that had surrounded her, of the curse feeding off her envy. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, and he could see it in Emily's eyes too. The fear, the uncertainty, it was pulling at them, straining the bond they had. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hall, making them all jump. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, but there was nothing behind them, just the empty, dark corridor. We need to keep moving, Dr. Carter said, her voice tense. We're too close now to turn back. But as they continued forward, Jason could feel the air between them growing thicker with tension. Emily was starting to fall behind, her steps slowing as her eyes darted nervously around the hall. Jason stayed close to her, trying to reassure her with his presence, but he could feel the strain in her every movement. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. Emily nodded, but her eyes told a different story. I keep thinking about Rachel. What if we're walking into something worse? What if this curse is stronger than we thought?" Jason didn't have an answer for her. He wanted to believe that they could survive this, that they could find a way to break the curse entirely. But the more they pressed forward, the more he felt the curse working its way into their minds, playing on their fears and insecurities. Dr. Carter suddenly stopped in front of a closed door, her hand resting on the handle. "This is it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason looked at her, feeling the unease rolling off her in waves. "What's behind that door?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Dr. Carter hesitated, her hand gripping the handle tighter. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think this is where the curse began." A heavy silence fell over them, the weight of her words sinking in. The origin of the curse. It was what they had been searching for. But now that they were here, Jason wasn't sure if they were ready to face it. The bond between them felt more fragile than ever, as if the smallest push could break it apart entirely. And Jason knew that if they didn't stay united, if they didn't hold on to each other, the curse would destroy them. With a deep breath, Dr. Carter pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs overhead. And in the center of the room, Jason saw something that made his blood run cold. A large mirror stood against the far wall, but it wasn't their reflections that stared back at them. It was Rachel. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted with envy, and beside her stood the shadowy figures from before. Their faces were unfamiliar, but their expressions were the same, twisted, envious, desperate. Jason could feel Emily tense beside him, her breath catching in her throat. This can't be real," she whispered. But Jason knew better. The curse had drawn them here for a reason. This was their final test, and if they couldn't resist the pull of envy, if they couldn't stay together, they would fall just like Rachel. The bond between them was shattering, but it wasn't too late. Not yet. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We have to face this together," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We can't let the curse tear us apart." Dr. Carter nodded, her face pale but resolute. Emily squeezed his hand, her fear still evident, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. They stepped into the room, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. But as the door closed behind them, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest enemy wasn't the curse itself. It was the cracks in the bond that held them together. And if they couldn't find a way to mend it, they wouldn't survive what was coming next. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our show for tonight. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next Sunday with episode 4, The Fourth Curse, Wrath. Until then, take care. Support us by liking, sharing, and leaving a comment. For more thrilling horror stories, visit our website at hradio.lovesitoblog.com/ and check out our store at hradio-ce-store.printify.me/products to grab your favorite items for the 2024 Halloween season.